The stars stretched endlessly before the human ship Valiant Edge as it moved through the darkness of space. Commander Jake Morrison sat in his chair on the bridge, watching the screens that showed the empty void around them. His crew had been exploring this region for 3 months, mapping new systems and searching for signs of other intelligent life. They had found planets, asteroids, and gas clouds, but no aliens. Until today, the sensors began beeping with an unusual pattern. Lieutenant Amy Collins looked up from her station, her face showing concern. She had been monitoring communications for weeks without hearing anything interesting. Now her screens were filled with signals that were clearly not natural. Someone else was out here. Jake stood up and walked to her station. He was a tall man with gray hair at his temples, a veteran of Earth's space program who had seen many strange things during his career. But he had never seen signals like these. Amy worked quickly, her fingers moving across the controls as she tried to understand what they were receiving. Within minutes, ships appeared on their sensors. Not one ship, but 5 large vessels that were clearly designed for war. They moved with purpose, surrounding the Valiant Edge in a formation that left no room for escape. Jake felt his heart beat faster, but he kept his face calm. His crew looked to him for leadership, and he would not show fear. The communication system activated with a burst of static. Then a voice spoke in a language they did not understand. Amy's computer worked to translate the words, using patterns and mathematical relationships to find meaning in the alien sounds. When the translation appeared on the screen, Jake read it slowly. The aliens called themselves the Zephrani Collective. They informed the humans that this region of space belonged to them. The human ship had entered their territory without permission. The penalty for this violation was clear. The humans must surrender their ship immediately, accept Zephrani authority, and submit to judgment. If they refused, they would be destroyed. Jake looked around his bridge at the 43 people who made up his crew. They were scientists, engineers, and explorers. They had left Earth to find new worlds and make peaceful contact with other species. They had not come here to fight, but they also had not come here to surrender to threats. Lieutenant Ben Carter, the first officer, stood beside Jake's chair. He was young, only 30 years old, and this was his first deep space mission. His voice was quiet when he spoke. He suggested that they should at least try to negotiate. Perhaps the aliens would listen to reason. Perhaps this was all a misunderstanding. Jake understood Ben's thinking. It made sense to try diplomacy first, but something about the alien message bothered him. The Zephrani had not asked questions. They had not tried to communicate or understand. They had simply issued demands and threats. That was not how peaceful species made first contact. He asked Amy to open a channel to the alien ships. When she nodded that the connection was ready, Jake spoke clearly and calmly. He explained that the humans meant no harm. They were explorers from a planet called Earth. They had not known this space was claimed by anyone. They would be happy to leave peacefully and discuss boundaries through proper diplomatic channels. The response came quickly. The Zephrani commander, who identified himself as Krelthar, repeated the demand. Surrender or die. There would be no negotiation. The Zephrani Collective had been the dominant power in this region for 10,000 years. Every species they encountered either joined them peacefully or was eliminated. The humans would make the same choice that others had made. Jake felt something shift inside him. He had studied history extensively during his years at the academy. He knew how his species had survived and thrived on Earth. Humans had faced countless threats over millions of years. They had competed with predators, fought diseases, and struggled against nature itself. They had survived by being adaptable, creative, and, when necessary, dangerous. He thought about the early human civilizations that had faced invasion and conquest. Some had surrendered and lost their identity. Others had fought and preserved their freedom. Earth's history was filled with stories of people who refused to bow to threats, even when the odds seemed impossible. Jake made his decision. He told Amy to send a message back to Krelthar. The message was simple and direct. The humans respectfully declined the Zephrani demand. The Valiant Edge would leave this region of space peacefully, but if the Zephrani chose to attack, the humans would defend themselves. Any aggressive action would be considered an act of war. Ben looked at his commander with wide eyes. The young officer had expected negotiation or retreat. He had not expected defiance. Around the bridge, other crew members showed similar reactions. Some looked frightened. Others looked determined. All of them waited to see what would happen next. Krelthar's response was immediate and predictable. The Zephrani commander seemed almost amused by the human response. He informed them that their defiance was foolish. The Zephrani ships were larger, more powerful, and more advanced. The human vessel was alone, surrounded and outmatched. Resistance was not just futile, it was ridiculous. Then the alien weapons powered up. The sensors on the Valiant Edge detected energy spikes from all 5 Zephrani ships. They were preparing to fire. Jake gave quick orders to his crew. Amy shut down all non-essential systems. Engineer Kyle Patterson diverted power to shields and engines. The helm officer, a woman named Lisa Howard, prepared for evasive maneuvers. The first shots came from the largest Zephrani vessel. Beams of bright energy crossed the distance between the ships in seconds. The shields of the Valiant Edge flared as they absorbed the impact. The ship shook and alarms began to sound. More shots followed from the other alien vessels. Jake's voice cut through the chaos on the bridge. He gave orders that surprised his crew. Instead of returning fire or trying to run, he commanded Lisa to take them into the nearby asteroid field. The dense cluster of rocks and debris would provide cover, but it was also dangerous. One wrong move could destroy them faster than the alien weapons. Lisa did not hesitate. She trusted her commander's judgment. The Valiant Edge turned sharply and accelerated toward the asteroids. Behind them, the Zephrani ships followed, firing continuously. Jake watched the tactical display as they entered the field. The asteroids surrounded them, hiding them from direct view. He ordered all power to be cut except for essential life support. The ship went dark and silent. The Zephrani would be searching for them with sensors, but without emissions to track, finding them would be difficult. Jake looked at his crew in the dim emergency lighting. His voice was calm when he spoke. He told them that they were no longer running. The Zephrani had made their choice. They had attacked without provocation. They had tried to kill innocent explorers. Now the rules had changed. Jake explained that humans had spent thousands of years learning to survive against threats. They knew how to hide, how to wait, and how to strike back. Ben asked what they were going to do. Jake's answer was simple. They were going to hunt. The asteroid field was vast and complex, filled with rocks ranging from tiny pebbles to mountains floating in space. The Valiant Edge drifted silently among them, powered down to the point where it looked like just another piece of debris. On the bridge, Jake Morrison and his crew waited in the darkness, watching their sensors carefully. The Zephrani ships moved through the field with confidence. Krelthar had ordered his vessels to spread out and search systematically. He expected to find the human ship within hours. His sensors were advanced, designed to detect even the smallest energy signatures. But the humans were not producing any energy to detect. 3 days passed. The crew of the Valiant Edge worked in shifts, maintaining absolute silence and minimal power usage. Amy Collins monitored the alien communications, listening to the growing frustration in Krelthar's voice. The Zephrani commander could not understand how a primitive vessel had simply vanished. His officers reported no signs of the human ship. No wreckage, no energy trails, nothing. Kyle Patterson gathered his engineering team in the cargo bay. They worked by the light of handheld lamps, modifying equipment and building new devices from spare parts. Kyle was a creative engineer who had always believed that the best solutions came from simple principles applied in clever ways. He showed his team how to create improvised weapons using materials they had on board. The first mine was built from a cargo container, some magnetic clamps, and an overcharged power cell. It was crude but effective. When a ship passed close enough, the mine would attach itself and detonate. Kyle and his team built 12 of these devices over the next 2 days. They used the ship's small maintenance drones to place the mines in strategic locations throughout the asteroid field. Jake studied the tactical display constantly. He watched the patterns of the Zephrani ships, learning their search protocols and identifying their weaknesses. He noticed that one ship, the smallest of the 5, always lagged behind the others. It was isolated for several minutes during each sweep of the field. That ship would be their first target. Lisa Howard received her orders and prepared the helm for a precision operation. She would have only seconds to execute the plan. The Valiant Edge would power up, move quickly to release a mine, then power down again before the Zephrani sensors could get a clear reading. It was risky, but Jake believed it would work. The moment came during the night shift, though day and night had little meaning in space. The isolated Zafrani ship moved through a section of the field that the Valiant Edge had mined carefully. Lisa brought the engines online and moved the ship with practiced skill. The mine was released and locked onto a large asteroid directly in the alien vessel's path. The Valiant Edge went dark again within seconds. The crew waited, barely breathing, as the Zafrani ship continued its search pattern. When it passed the asteroid, the mine's magnetic clamps activated and the device attached itself to the alien hull. 3 seconds later, it exploded. The detonation was brilliant against the darkness of space. The Zafrani ship's shields absorbed most of the blast, but the explosion damaged their sensor array and navigation systems. The vessel began to tumble, unable to control its movement among the asteroids. It crashed into a large rock and secondary explosions erupted across its hull. Within minutes, the ship was destroyed. Krelthar's communications suddenly filled with panic and confusion. The other Zafrani ships rushed toward the location of the explosion, searching for the attacker. But they found only wreckage and asteroids. Amy listened to their transmissions and translated them for Jake. The aliens were afraid. They had not expected any resistance, and now one of their ships was gone. Jake called his senior officers together for a meeting in the small conference room. Ben Carter asked the obvious question. What would they do next? They had destroyed one enemy ship, but 4 remained. The Zafrani were now alert and searching actively. The element of surprise was gone. Jake explained his thinking. The Zafrani expected enemies to fight in predictable ways. They expected ships to face each other in open space, trading fire until one side won. But humans had learned different methods of warfare over thousands of years. They had learned to use terrain to strike from hiding to make every advantage count. The asteroid field was their terrain now. Kyle presented his next innovation. His team had discovered that the Zafrani ships produced a specific type of energy signature when they charged their weapons. He had modified some of their sensors to detect this signature and built devices that could emit it artificially. The idea was clever. They would make the aliens think they were being targeted, causing them to waste energy and reveal their positions. Over the next week, the hunt continued. The Valiant Edge moved like a ghost through the asteroids, never staying in one place for long. They set traps, created false signals, and studied their enemies carefully. The Zafrani ships became more cautious, moving slowly and staying close together for mutual protection. The second ship was destroyed when it investigated what appeared to be a powered-up human vessel. Amy had used a transmitter attached to an asteroid to broadcast signals that mimicked the Valiant Edge's systems. When the Zafrani ship approached, it triggered a chain reaction of mines that Kyle had carefully positioned. The explosion was massive, and the alien vessel had no time to escape. Krelthar began to understand that he was not hunting prey. He was being hunted by something that understood warfare at a level his people had forgotten. The Zafrani had not fought a real war in thousands of years. They had simply overwhelmed weaker species with superior numbers and technology. But the humans were different. They were using inferior technology to achieve superior results. Ben Carter was changing during these days. He watched Jake Morrison make decisions that seemed crazy but worked perfectly. He learned that warfare was not about having the best weapons. It was about understanding your enemy, using your environment, and staying calm under pressure. The young officer began to think like a hunter instead of a victim. The third Zafrani ship fell to a different kind of trap. Lisa piloted the Valiant Edge in a dangerous maneuver that brought them close to the alien vessel. Kyle had modified one of their communications arrays to emit a pulse that disrupted Zafrani shield systems. The pulse only worked at close range and only lasted a few seconds, but those few seconds were enough. With the shields down, Amy fired one of their few missiles directly at the enemy ship's engine core. The missile was small compared to Zafrani weapons, but it hit a vulnerable point at exactly the right moment. The alien ship's engines exploded, and the vessel was torn apart by the internal blast. Now only 2 Zafrani ships remained, including Krelthar's flagship. The alien commander sent a message on all frequencies. He demanded that the humans show themselves and face him directly. He accused them of fighting without honor, of using cowardly tactics, of hiding like frightened animals. Jake listened to the message and smiled. He told Amy to record his response. When she indicated that the system was ready, Jake spoke clearly. He explained that honor did not mean stupidity. Honor meant fighting intelligently, protecting your people, and making the enemy pay for their aggression. The Zafrani had attacked without provocation. They had tried to kill innocent explorers. Now they were learning that humans did not forgive such actions easily. He ended his message with a simple statement. The Zafrani had two choices. They could leave this region of space immediately and report to their leaders that they had encountered a species that would not submit. Or they could continue fighting and die like their companions. The choice was theirs, but they had 1 hour to decide. Krelthar did not respond with words. Instead, his two remaining ships charged their weapons and began a systematic bombardment of the asteroid field. They fired at anything that might be hiding a ship. Explosions erupted across the field as asteroids were destroyed by powerful energy beams. Jake watched the destruction calmly. He had expected this response. The Zafrani were angry and desperate, but their bombardment was using enormous amounts of energy. Soon their weapons would need to recharge, and when that happened, the Valiant Edge would strike again. The hunt was not over. The bombardment lasted for 3 hours. The Zafrani ships fired until their weapon systems began to overheat. Thousands of asteroids were reduced to dust and gas. The field was lit by continuous explosions that turned the darkness into a display of destructive power. But when the firing finally stopped, the Valiant Edge remained intact, hidden in a section of the field that the aliens had not yet reached. Jake Morrison ordered his crew to prepare for the final engagement. They had studied the Zafrani ships carefully during the past weeks. They understood the alien technology, its strengths and weaknesses. Now it was time to end this fight. But Jake had one rule that he made absolutely clear to everyone. They would disable the enemy ships, not destroy them. Once the Zafrani stopped fighting, the killing would stop. Ben Carter questioned this decision. He pointed out that the aliens had shown no mercy. They had tried to kill the entire crew of the Valiant Edge without hesitation. Why should humans show restraint now? Jake's answer was simple but profound. Humans showed restraint because that was what separated them from mindless predators. Killing when necessary was acceptable. Killing when it was no longer necessary was murder. The crew prepared the ship for combat. Kyle Patterson had saved their most powerful weapon for this moment. He had modified their main deflector array to emit a concentrated electromagnetic pulse. The pulse would overload the Zafrani ship's systems temporarily, giving the Valiant Edge a brief window to strike at critical systems. It was risky because it would reveal their position immediately, but the battle had reached the point where hiding was no longer an option. Lisa Howard studied the tactical display, planning her approach carefully. The two remaining Zafrani ships were flying close together, protecting each other. She would need to position the Valiant Edge perfectly to catch both vessels in the pulse radius. There would be no second chance. If the pulse failed or missed its target, the alien ships would destroy them before they could escape. The Valiant Edge powered up completely for the first time in weeks. All systems came online, and the ship emerged from its hiding place among the asteroids. The Zafrani sensors detected them immediately. Krelthar's voice came over the communication channel, filled with triumph. He thought the humans had finally made a fatal mistake by revealing themselves. Both alien ships turned toward the Valiant Edge and charged their weapons. Energy levels spiked across their hulls as they prepared to fire everything they had at the human vessel. But Lisa was already moving, bringing the ship into position with precise control. She counted down the seconds in her mind, waiting for exactly the right moment. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from the Valiant Edge like invisible lightning. It washed over both Zafrani ships in an instant. Their shields flickered and failed. Their weapons powered down. Their engines stuttered. For 15 precious seconds, the alien vessels were helpless, drifting without power or defenses. Amy Collins launched a series of small missiles during those 15 seconds. The missiles were not designed to destroy. Instead, they carried penetrating warheads that drilled into the Zafrani ship's hulls and released electromagnetic charges inside. These charges fried the aliens' engine controls, weapon systems, and navigation computers. The Zafrani ships went dark and began to drift. Jake opened a communication channel to Krelthar. He spoke calmly and clearly. The fight was over. The Zafrani ships were disabled but intact. The crews were alive. If Krelthar agreed to stop hostilities immediately, Jake would provide assistance to repair their life support systems and ensure their survival until rescue arrived. But if the Zafrani tried to continue fighting, Jake would have no choice but to destroy both ships completely. There was a long silence. Then Krelthar's voice came through the speakers, and it sounded different than before. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been respect or perhaps fear. The Zafrani commander agreed to Jake's terms. He ordered his remaining crew members to stand down and accept the human offer of assistance. Kyle Patterson led a team across to the alien ships using their small shuttle. He wore a spacesuit and carried tools but no weapons. The Zafrani crew members watched with confusion as the humans worked to repair their life support systems. Kyle showed them how to bypass the damaged circuits and restore power to essential systems. He was efficient and professional, treating the aliens with the same care he would give to his own crew. The news of what happened in the asteroid field spread quickly through the galaxy. The Zafrani Collective sent emergency messages to the Galactic Council, describing the encounter with the humans. Other species monitored these transmissions and began asking questions. Who were these humans? Where had they come from? And why had they fought so differently than any other species? Within days, ships from a dozen different civilizations arrived at the edge of human space. They sent diplomatic requests, asking to speak with representatives of Earth's government. The galactic community wanted answers. Some species were curious. Others were afraid. All of them wanted to understand what had happened. Earth's government responded by sending a delegation to meet with the alien ambassadors. The delegation was led by Ambassador Richard Hayes, a man who had served in Earth's military before becoming a diplomat. He understood both warfare and peace. He was accompanied by scientists, cultural experts, and military advisors. They traveled to a neutral space station where the Galactic Council had agreed to meet. The council chamber was impressive. Representatives from dozens of species sat in a circular arrangement, each in their own environmental section suited to their biology. Richard Hayes stood in the center and looked around at the assembled aliens. Some looked like insects, others like plants or geometric shapes. A few resembled creatures from Earth's oceans, but all of them were watching him with intense interest. The first question came from a being called Sornthar, a representative of the Velnar Collective. This ancient species had been observing galactic affairs for thousands of years. Sornthar asked why the humans had responded to the Zafrani attack with such violence. Why had they not simply surrendered and entered into negotiations as other species had done? Richard's answer was direct and honest. He explained that surrender was not negotiation. When someone threatens to kill you unless you obey them, that is not diplomacy. That is coercion. Humans had learned through hard experience that giving in to bullies only encouraged more bullying. Sometimes the only way to achieve real peace was to show that you could not be intimidated. A Krolathi ambassador, a species known for their logical thinking, asked a different question. The Krolathi wanted to know how humans had defeated a superior force using inferior technology. Richard smiled at this question. He explained that humans had been fighting wars for their entire history. They had developed strategies and tactics over thousands of years. They understood that technology was just one factor in warfare. Psychology, creativity, and determination were often more important. But the question that surprised Richard came from a small insect-like being called Trilvar. This ambassador asked about something that confused most of the galactic species. Why had the humans stopped fighting once the Zafrani surrendered? Why had they helped repair the alien ships? In galactic history, wars typically ended with complete destruction of one side or immediate submission before fighting began. This concept of measured violence was unknown. Richard took his time answering this question. He talked about honor, about the rules that humans had developed to make warfare less terrible. He explained that humans believed fighting should have limits. You fought to protect yourself and achieve your goals, but you did not kill unnecessarily. When an enemy surrendered, you accepted that surrender and treated them with respect. This was not weakness. It was strength under control. He told them about the Geneva Conventions, ancient human agreements that set rules for warfare. He described how human soldiers were taught to protect civilians, treat prisoners humanely, and distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. These rules were not always followed perfectly, but they represented an ideal that humans strive to achieve. The Galactic Council listened with fascination. Many species had either become completely peaceful, avoiding all conflict, or they fought wars of total extermination. This middle path, where species remained capable of violence but chose to limit it through honor and rules, was something new. Krelthar himself was brought before the council to give testimony. The Zafrani commander stood in the center of the chamber and described the battle from his perspective. He admitted that he had underestimated the humans completely. He had thought them weak because their technology was primitive. He had not understood that they were experienced, warriors who had simply not needed to develop advanced weapons, because they were so skilled at using what they had. But what affected Krelthar most deeply was how Jake Morrison had treated him after the battle. The human commander could have killed him easily. Instead, Jake had shown mercy and offered help. Krelthar told the council that this experience had taught him something important. True strength was not about destroying your enemies. It was about having the power to destroy them and choosing not to. The Galactic Council remained divided after hearing the testimonies. Some species wanted to welcome humanity into the galactic community immediately. Others argued for caution, suggesting that humans were too dangerous to integrate freely. The Zafrani delegation demanded compensation for their lost ships and crew members. They insisted that humanity be punished for destroying Zafrani property and killing Zafrani citizens. Ambassador Richard Hayes listened to these arguments patiently. When he was given a chance to respond, he pointed out a simple fact. The Zafrani had attacked first without provocation. They had fired on a peaceful exploration vessel and tried to kill everyone aboard. Under both human law and common sense, the Valiant Edge had acted in self-defense. If anyone owed compensation, it was the Zafrani who should pay for the unprovoked attack. This statement caused an uproar in the council chamber. The Zafrani representatives protested loudly. They argued that entering their space without permission was itself an act of aggression. Richard countered by asking a simple question. If accidentally crossing an unmarked border justified immediate execution, what did that say about Zafrani justice? Sornthar of the Velnar Collective called for order. The ancient being suggested that the council was focusing on the wrong issues. The question was not who was right or wrong in a single incident. The question was how humanity should be integrated into the galactic community. Would they be accepted as equals or treated as subordinates? Over the next few days, the council heard presentations about human culture, history, and capabilities. Scientists shared data about Earth's development and the human species' evolution. What they revealed shocked many council members. Humans were among the most competitive and aggressive species ever encountered. They had evolved as persistence hunters, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Their entire biology was designed for endurance and determination. But the data also showed something else. Humans were highly social creatures who formed complex bonds and cooperated in large groups. They had developed art, music, philosophy, and moral systems. They could be violent when threatened, but also incredibly compassionate. They saved injured strangers, cared for the weak, and created societies based on justice and fairness. The Krolathi ambassador found this combination fascinating. Logic suggested that aggressive species should be less cooperative, yet humans were both. When asked to explain this paradox, Richard said it was not a paradox at all. Humans cooperated intensely with their own groups, which made them more effective at competing with other groups. Over time, these groups grew larger until they encompassed entire nations, and eventually their whole species. While the council debated, Krelthar was dealing with his own problems. He had returned to Zafrani space in disgrace. His superiors blamed him for the loss of 3 ships and the humiliation of their fleet. They stripped him of his command and demoted him to a lower rank. But Krelthar's shame went deeper than his career. He felt he had failed to understand his enemy, and that failure had cost lives. In Zafrani culture, there was an ancient tradition that had not been used in 5,000 years. It was called the Trial of Honor, a formal combat between representatives of 2 sides to settle disputes. Krelthar petitioned his government to invoke this tradition. He would challenge the humans to single combat. If he won, humanity would acknowledge Zafrani superiority. If he lost, the matter would be settled and no further compensation would be demanded. The Zafrani government agreed, seeing this as a way to save face. They sent the challenge to the Galactic Council. Many species were surprised that such an old tradition was being revived. But Richard Hayes understood what was happening. This was not really about settling the dispute. It was about giving Krelthar a chance to redeem himself. Earth's government discussed how to respond. Some officials wanted to refuse the challenge, arguing that formal combat was barbaric and unnecessary. Others suggested sending their best fighter to ensure victory. But Richard had a different idea. He recommended sending someone who understood both combat and diplomacy, someone who could win the fight while teaching a lesson about honor. Captain Greg Palmer was chosen to represent humanity. He was 45 years old and had served in Earth's military during the Unification Wars, a series of conflicts that had finally brought all of Earth's nations under a single government. Greg had seen real combat, not simulations or exercises. He understood what it meant to face an enemy who wanted to kill you, but he also understood mercy and restraint. Greg arrived at the neutral station where the trial of honor would take place. The combat arena was a large spherical room with artificial gravity and transparent walls, so observers could watch. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to witness the event. This was the first trial of honor in millennia, and everyone wanted to see how it would unfold. Before the combat began, Greg did something unexpected. He presented a document to Krelthar and the assembled witnesses. It was a set of rules for the fight. Greg explained that if they were going to have formal combat, there should be formal rules to make it fair and honorable. The rules were simple but comprehensive. Both fighters would use similar weapons. The combat area was clearly defined. Certain attacks that could cause permanent injury were prohibited. Most importantly, the fight would end when one combatant yielded or was unable to continue. Death was not required for victory. Krelthar read the rules carefully. In ancient Zephrani tradition, trials of honor typically ended in death. But he remembered Jake Morrison's mercy after the space battle. Perhaps the humans had a different understanding of honor, one that did not require killing. He agreed to Greg's rules. The two fighters entered the arena. They were given staffs as weapons, simple tools that required skill rather than technology. Greg wore light armor that covered his vital areas but allowed free movement. Krelthar wore similar protection adapted for his body structure. The Zephrani was taller and had 4 arms instead of 2, giving him an apparent advantage. When the combat began, Krelthar attacked aggressively. He used all 4 arms to strike from multiple angles, trying to overwhelm Greg with speed and numbers. But Greg had trained for years in multiple combat styles. He moved efficiently, blocking and evading rather than trying to match Krelthar's aggression. He watched for patterns in the aliens' attacks, learning and adapting. The fight lasted 20 minutes. Greg took several hits, but none that disabled him. He waited patiently for his opportunity. When Krelthar made a slight mistake in his footwork, Greg struck precisely at the alien's lower left arm, causing him to drop his staff. Before Krelthar could recover, Greg swept his legs and brought him down. Krelthar lay on the ground, disarmed and at Greg's mercy. The human captain stood over him with his staff raised, ready to deliver the final blow. The audience watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen. According to tradition, Greg had won and could end the fight however he chose. Greg lowered his staff and extended his hand to Krelthar. His voice was clear and respectful when he spoke. The fight was over. Krelthar had fought with courage and skill. There was no shame in being defeated by a worthy opponent. Greg offered to help the alien stand, as a gesture of respect between warriors. Krelthar stared at the extended hand for a long moment. Then he reached up and took it. Greg pulled him to his feet, and the two fighters stood facing each other. Krelthar made a gesture that in Zephrani culture indicated deep respect. He told Greg that he understood now what human honor meant. It was not about being the strongest or the most deadly. It was about knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. The observers in the arena erupted in discussion. Some species were moved by what they had witnessed. Others were confused. A few thought the whole thing was pointless. But everyone agreed that humans were unlike any species they had encountered before. After the trial of honor, the Galactic Council's attitude began to shift. The Velner Collective proposed a new relationship with humanity. Instead of trying to integrate humans into the existing galactic structure, they suggested learning from human concepts of honor and measured violence. Perhaps the galaxy had become too soft, too willing to submit to any threat. Perhaps humans could teach them how to maintain peace through strength. Richard Hayes worked with the Council to establish formal diplomatic relations between Earth and the galactic community. Humans would be recognized as a sovereign species with full rights and responsibilities. In return, humanity agreed to share their knowledge of warfare, ethics, and tactical training with other species who wanted to learn. Krelthar requested permission to visit Earth. He wanted to study human military history and understand how they had developed their code of honor. His request was granted, and he became one of the first aliens to set foot on humanity's homeworld. What he learned there would change not just his own life, but the future of the entire galaxy. Krelthar arrived on Earth 3 months after the Trial of Honor. He stood at the viewing platform of the landing facility and looked out at humanity's homeworld with wonder. The planet was beautiful, covered in blue oceans and green continents with white clouds drifting across the atmosphere. But what amazed him most was the sheer diversity. Earth had millions of different species living together in complex ecosystems. Captain Greg Palmer met Krelthar at the facility and became his guide during the visit. They traveled to several locations around the planet, visiting military academies, historical sites, and cultural centers. Greg explained that understanding human warfare required understanding human history, and that meant seeing where humans had come from. Their first stop was a museum dedicated to ancient warfare. Krelthar walked through exhibits showing weapons from different eras of human history. He saw stone spears that were hundreds of thousands of years old, bronze swords from early civilizations, steel armor from medieval times, and firearms from more recent centuries. Each display showed how humans had continuously improved their ability to fight. But Greg pointed out something else in the museum. Alongside the weapons were treaties, peace agreements, and rules of war from various cultures and time periods. Even in their most violent eras, humans had tried to limit the destruction of warfare. They had created codes of conduct for soldiers, rules for treating prisoners, and agreements to protect civilians. One exhibit particularly fascinated Krelthar. It showed documents from something called the Geneva Conventions, a series of international treaties that established rules for armed conflict. Greg explained that these treaties were created after particularly terrible wars, when humans realized they needed to limit the suffering that warfare caused. The conventions protected wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilian populations. Krelthar asked why humans would limit themselves during war. Would it not be more effective to use all available force without restriction? Greg's answer was thoughtful. He explained that unlimited warfare often created so much hatred and suffering that peace became impossible. By showing restraint and honor even during conflict, you made it possible for enemies to become friends after the fighting ended. They visited a military academy where young officers were being trained. Krelthar observed classes on tactics, strategy, and weapons systems. But he also saw classes on ethics, international law, and conflict resolution. The cadets were taught how to fight effectively, but they were also taught when fighting was necessary and when it should be avoided. One instructor, a veteran named Colonel Helen Brooks, invited Krelthar to speak to her class. The alien commander shared his experience fighting against the Valiant Edge. He described how he had underestimated the humans and paid a terrible price. He talked about losing 3 ships and many crew members because he had assumed that superior technology guaranteed victory. The cadets listened intently as Krelthar explained what he had learned. Technology and firepower were important, but they were not everything. Understanding your enemy, using your environment cleverly, and maintaining discipline under pressure were equally vital. But most importantly, he told them about Jake Morrison's mercy. The human commander could have killed him but chose not to. That choice had affected Krelthar more than any weapon could have. Colonel Brooks asked Krelthar what he thought was humanity's greatest strength. The alien considered the question carefully before answering. He said that humans had learned to balance 2 things that seemed contradictory. They were fierce warriors who could be incredibly violent when necessary, but they were also capable of great compassion and could show mercy to defeated enemies. This balance made them formidable in war and successful in peace. While Krelthar was learning about human culture, Ambassador Richard Hayes was working with the Galactic Council to establish new programs. The first program was a military exchange where human officers would teach tactical training to other species. The second was a diplomatic initiative to create galactic rules for warfare, similar to Earth's Geneva Conventions but adapted for the diverse species of the galaxy. Lieutenant Amy Collins from the Valiant Edge became the director of the first interspecies military academy. The academy was built on a neutral space station and accepted students from any species that wanted to learn. Amy taught communications and intelligence gathering, showing aliens how humans collected information and used it to make strategic decisions. Ben Carter, who had grown so much during the encounter with the Zephrani, became an instructor in tactical planning. He taught students how to analyze situations, identify advantages, and create flexible plans that could adapt to changing circumstances. His classes were popular because he used real examples from the asteroid field battle, showing how the Valiant Edge had defeated a superior force. Kyle Patterson led the engineering program, teaching students how to modify and adapt technology creatively. He emphasized that the best weapons were often the simplest ones used in clever ways. His students learned to think beyond standard solutions and find innovative approaches to problems. Within a year, the Academy had graduated its first class of students. These graduates returned to their home worlds and began implementing what they had learned. The changes were gradual but significant. Species that had always relied on overwhelming force began to develop more sophisticated tactics. Civilizations that had been easy victims of aggression learned to defend themselves effectively. Jake Morrison retired from active space exploration and became a special advisor to Earth's government on alien relations. He worked with Richard Hayes to establish protocols for future first contacts, ensuring that no human ship would ever be as unprepared as the Valiant Edge had been. But he also made sure that the protocols emphasized peaceful communication and mutual respect. The Zephrani Collective underwent perhaps the biggest transformation. After Krelthar returned from Earth, he wrote a detailed report about what he had learned. He argued that the Zephrani had become weak through their reliance on intimidation and superior technology. They had forgotten that true strength came from skill, discipline, and honor. Many Zephrani resisted these ideas at first. They had been the dominant power in their region for thousands of years. Why should they change? But Krelthar's arguments were persuasive, especially when combined with the embarrassing defeat their fleet had suffered. Slowly, the Zephrani began to reform their military and adopt some human concepts of honorable warfare. The most surprising development came when the Zephrani proposed a formal alliance with humanity. They wanted to learn more about human warfare and culture. They offered to share their advanced technology in exchange for human tactical training. After careful consideration, Earth's government agreed. The alliance was signed at a ceremony attended by representatives from dozens of galactic species. Lisa Howard, the pilot who had flown the Valiant Edge so skillfully during the battle, became the captain of a new type of ship. The vessel was jointly designed by humans and Zephrani, combining human tactical innovation with alien technology. It was intended to patrol the frontier regions of known space, protecting colonies and trade routes from pirates and raiders. The ship was crewed by both humans and aliens working together. Lisa found that teaching aliens to fly like humans was challenging but rewarding. Human pilots relied heavily on intuition and improvisation, while most alien pilots followed strict protocols. But when you combined human creativity with alien precision, the results were impressive. 5 years after the encounter in the asteroid field, the galaxy looked very different. Warfare had not ended because conflict was inevitable when so many different species and cultures interacted. But the nature of warfare had changed. Battles were fought with clear objectives and defined limits. Prisoners were treated humanely. Civilians were protected, and defeated enemies were given the chance to surrender with honor. A group of philosophers from various species studied these changes and wrote a document they called the Warrior's Code. It was based on human principles but adapted for the diverse species of the galaxy. The code stated that strength should serve honor, that violence should be measured and purposeful, and that mercy to the defeated was a sign of true power. Not every species accepted the Warrior's Code immediately. Some still preferred their old ways of either complete pacifism or total war. But gradually, more and more civilizations adopted at least some of the principles. The code became a standard for behavior, something that civilized species were expected to follow. Greg Palmer was asked to speak at a galactic conference about honor and warfare. He stood before representatives from hundreds of species and shared his perspective. He explained that humans had not invented honor or mercy. Every species had the capacity for these virtues. But humans had learned through painful experience that honor was not optional. It was necessary for survival. He told them about Earth's history, about the terrible wars that had nearly destroyed human civilization. He described how humans had finally learned that they needed rules and limits, not because rules made them weak, but because rules made peace possible. Without honor, warfare became endless. Without mercy, enemies could never become friends. Krelthar stood beside Greg during this. 10 years had passed since the Valiant Edge encountered the Zephrani fleet in that distant asteroid field. The galaxy had changed in ways that few could have predicted. Human influence had spread not through conquest or colonization, but through the simple act of teaching others how to fight with honor. Jake Morrison walked through the halls of the Interspecies Military Academy that Amy Collins had founded. The facility had grown enormously over the decade. What started as a small program on a space station had expanded into a full university with campuses on multiple worlds. Thousands of students from hundreds of species studied here, learning not just tactics and strategy, but also the ethical principles that made warfare serve peace rather than destroy it. Jake had been invited to give a lecture to the graduating class. He was older now, his hair completely gray, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had helped him survive against impossible odds. He stood before a diverse audience of young officers representing dozens of different species. Some looked like insects, others resembled plants or geometric constructions of light, but all of them wore the same uniform, marked with the symbol of the warrior's code. He began his lecture by telling them about the day everything changed. He described the moment when the Zephrani issued their ultimatum, and he had to make a choice. Surrender and lose humanity's freedom, or fight and risk everything. He talked about the fear he felt, knowing that his decision would affect not just his crew but potentially his entire species. But Jake emphasized that the decision itself was less important than what came after. Choosing to fight was only the beginning. How you fought, why you fought, and when you stopped fighting, those were the things that truly mattered. He told them about the mines and traps, the careful planning and patient waiting. But he also told them about the moment when the Zephrani ships were disabled, and he had to decide whether to destroy them or show mercy. That decision, he explained, had changed everything. If he had killed Krelthar and his remaining crew out of anger or revenge, the galaxy would have learned that humans were just another violent species. But by showing mercy and offering help, he had demonstrated that humans fought with purpose and honor, not from hatred or cruelty. A young Krolathi student raised a question. She asked if mercy was always the right choice. What if the enemy refused to surrender? What if they used your mercy against you? Jake nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. He explained that mercy did not mean being foolish or allowing yourself to be exploited. It meant giving others the chance to do the right thing, but being prepared if they chose not to. The lecture continued for 2 hours. Jake answered questions, shared stories, and tried to help these young officers understand the complex balance between strength and compassion. When the lecture ended, the students gave him a standing ovation. Many of them would go on to become military leaders in their own civilizations, and they would carry Jake's lessons with them. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the changes that humans had initiated continued to unfold. Captain Nicole Barnes commanded a joint task force that protected frontier colonies from raiders and pirates. Her fleet included ships from 7 different species, all working together under the principles of the warrior's code. They had become known as the Guardians, and their reputation for fair but firm enforcement of galactic law had brought stability to regions that had once been chaotic. Nicole had learned to work with species that thought very differently than humans. Her first officer was a Zephrani named Krelvar, a nephew of Krelthar who had joined the fleet specifically to learn from humans. Her tactical officer was a Velnar, who processed information 10 times faster than any human, but sometimes struggled to understand intuitive decisions. Her engineering chief was a Krolathi, who approached every problem with pure logic but had learned to appreciate human creativity. Together, they had responded to dozens of crises. They had stopped pirate attacks, mediated disputes between colonies, and even prevented a few wars from starting. But they always followed the same principles. They used the minimum force necessary. They protected civilians above all else. They offered enemies the chance to surrender before fighting. And they treated prisoners with dignity and respect. One particular incident became famous throughout the galaxy. A group of raiders had taken hostages on a mining colony. The raiders were desperate and heavily armed. Previous attempts to negotiate had failed. The local government wanted to attack and overwhelm the raiders with force, accepting that many hostages would likely die in the crossfire. Nicole refused this approach. Instead, she sent a small team led by Ben Carter to infiltrate the facility. Ben had become an expert in what humans called special operations, missions that required skill and precision rather than overwhelming force. His team consisted of specialists from 4 different species, each chosen for their unique abilities. The mission took 18 hours. Ben's team moved silently through the facility, avoiding detection and carefully mapping the raiders' positions. They identified the locations of all hostages and planned their approach down to the second. When they finally struck, it was with surgical precision. The raiders were neutralized without a single hostage being harmed. But what happened next surprised everyone. Ben did not simply arrest the raiders and turn them over for punishment. He sat down with their leader, a desperate individual named Court who had turned to crime after losing everything in an economic collapse. Ben listened to Court's story and understood that these were not evil people. They were desperate people who had made terrible choices. Ben arranged for the raiders to face justice, but he also advocated for them to receive help, rather than just punishment. He argued that people who committed crimes out of desperation deserved a chance at rehabilitation. The colony government was skeptical, but they agreed to try Ben's approach. Most of the raiders eventually became productive members of society. This incident exemplified what the Warriors' Code had become. It was not just about fighting with honor. It was about understanding that most conflicts had roots in misunderstanding, desperation, or fear. Sometimes violence was necessary, but often the better solution was addressing the underlying problems that caused conflict in the first place. Krelthar himself had become one of the most influential voices for reform in the galaxy. After spending years studying human culture and military history, he had written several books about honor, warfare, and peace. His writings were read by millions across hundreds of worlds. He argued that the galaxy had lost something important when it abandoned the concept of honorable warfare. In his most famous book, titled The Balance of Strength, Krelthar explained that complete pacifism was impossible in a universe where different species competed for resources and had conflicting interests. But unrestrained violence led to endless cycles of revenge and destruction. The solution was to maintain the capacity for violence while constraining it with honor and ethics. He wrote about his encounter with Jake Morrison and how it had changed his life. He described the shame he felt when he realized he had attacked innocent explorers without even trying to communicate. He talked about the respect he developed for Greg Palmer during their combat trial. And he explained how these experiences had taught him that being defeated could be the beginning of wisdom rather than the end of honor. The book became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. Young officers from dozens of species studied Krelthar's transformation from an arrogant commander to a thoughtful philosopher. Many of them cited his example when explaining why they chose to serve in armed forces that followed the Warriors' Code. Richard Hayes had become Earth's primary ambassador to the Galactic Council. He spent most of his time working on complex diplomatic issues, mediating disputes between species, and helping to establish frameworks for cooperation. But he always remembered that human influence in the galaxy had come not from diplomacy but from the actions of people like Jake Morrison and Greg Palmer. He gave an interview to a Galactic News service where he reflected on humanity's journey. The interviewer asked why humans had been so successful at changing galactic culture when they were still relatively weak in terms of technology and numbers. Richard's answer was simple but profound. Humans had not changed the galaxy through strength or cleverness, he explained. They had changed it by offering something that had been missing. For thousands of years, the galaxy had been divided between species that avoided all violence and species that used violence without restraint. Humans showed there was a middle path, where you could be strong without being cruel, where you could fight without losing your humanity. The interviewer pressed further. Would humanity always maintain this balance, or would they eventually become either too peaceful or too violent? Richard admitted he did not know. Human history showed that people could go in either direction, but he believed that as long as humans remembered the lessons of their past and maintained their code of honor, they would continue to be a positive force in the galaxy. Amy Collins had become one of the most respected educators in known space. Her academy had trained thousands of officers who now served in militaries across the galaxy. But she was most proud of something else. Her students did not just